This episode of Real Law Review was made possible by Skillshare. Learn to think like a lawyer for free for 2 months by clicking the link in the description. Paul Manafort lied so much that the Mueller team is ripping up his plea agreement. This is very unusual, and this has huge implications for the entire Trump legal defense team. Let's think like a lawyer. On today's Real Law Review, I want to talk about all the implications that come as a result of Paul Manafort breaking the terms of his plea agreement with the Mueller legal team, including 1, why Manafort is going to jail for a long time, 2, how he has exposed all of his communications with President Trump and the rest of the Trump team, including those protected by attorney-client privilege, and 3, why even a pardon won't save Paul Manafort. This has huge implications for everyone, including the president. You may recall that Paul Manafort was indicted in 2 separate jurisdictions. He was a defendant in one particular criminal case in the Eastern District of Virginia, that's federal court, as well as the District of DC, which again is another federal district. The Eastern District of Virginia, because of its proximity to DC, handles a lot of very high-profile federal cases, and this is no exception to that. The Virginia case went to trial first. Paul Manafort was convicted on most of the crimes alleged in the Eastern District of Virginia case, and the jury hung on a few of those claims, meaning they weren't able to come to a unanimous decision on those particular claims. As a result of losing so many of the claims in the Virginia case, enough to put him away for the rest of his life, Manafort and his legal team decided to plead out in DC, meaning he took a plea agreement where he got a reduced sentence in exchange for him cooperating with the ongoing Mueller investigation. Not surprisingly, the plea agreement that Mueller and Manafort entered into requires that Manafort cooperate entirely, not only into the actual crimes that he was indicted and convicted of, but also for any investigations that Mueller wants his cooperation with and that Manafort might have some information that would help out. Manafort pleaded pursuant to an agreement that required his fully, truthfully, completely, and forthrightly cooperating with the government. According to the sentencing memo that the Mueller team just filed, the plea agreement provides that if the defendant, Manafort, fails to fulfill completely each and every one of his obligations under the plea agreement, or, quote, engages in any criminal activity prior to sentencing, the defendant, Manafort, will be in breach of the agreement. And of course, a breach relieves the government of any obligations under the plea agreement, including its agreement to a reduction of the sentencing guidelines for acceptance and responsibility, but leaves intact all of the obligations of the defendant as well as his guilty pleas. Which means that if Manafort violated the plea agreement, he is not entitled to any reduction of any of the crimes that he was convicted of, and in fact, he cannot withdraw his guilty plea as a result. No matter what, Manafort is going to be stuck with his admission of guilt with no reduction in sentence. In a status report that the Mueller team recently filed both in DC and Virginia, according to Mueller, after signing the plea agreement, Manafort committed federal crimes by lying to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Special Counsel's Office on a variety of subject matters, which constitute breaches of the agreement. The government will file a detailed sentencing submission to the probation department and the court in advance of the sentencing that sets forth the nature of the defendant's crimes and lies, including those after signing the plea agreement herein. This is a bombshell filing by the Mueller team. It is very rare for these kinds of plea agreements to blow up, and what the Mueller team has hinted at here is that Manafort not only just lied once and failed to communicate, but lied on a variety of different subjects. So what are the consequences of this plea agreement blowing up? Well, for one, the Mueller team won't be able to use Paul Manafort as a cooperating witness. They won't be able to rely on his testimony at trial. They won't get him to waive his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. And of course, Paul Manafort is going to jail for a very, very long time. The reason you enter into one of these plea agreements is to get a reduction in your sentence. You make it easier for the government to prove their case, you admit your guilt, and in exchange, the government gives you a letter saying saying that you should get a reduction in sentence. A judge has some leeway in what sentence is actually handed down. There are federal guidelines, federal sentencing guidelines that provide a certain range, and the judge is allowed to choose from within that range. And the government states that because you cooperated with their investigation, you should get a reduction in your sentence at the low end of the sentencing guideline range. Of course, when you back out of a plea agreement like this, the government no longer needs to say nice things about you and no longer needs to argue that you should get a reduction in your sentence. And in fact, they will do exactly the opposite. Instead, the government will argue that because of your bad conduct, you should get an enhancement in your sentence. You should be at the high end of the range. Or if you engaged in new crimes, then you can be sentenced to additional time that was not reflected in your original guilty plea. So Paual Manafort is in a world of hurt. Manafort's breach of the plea agreement and lies to federal prosecutors may be related to a report coming out of the UK's Guardian newspaper, which reports that Paual Manafort met extensively with Julian Assange of WikiLeaks before the 2016 election. If that is proved to be true, that could have huge implications for the conspiracy and collusion investigation that's going on. On top of that, there is yet another bombshell that reports that while Manafort was acting as a cooperating witness with the Mueller team, both Manafort and his attorneys were passing secret information to President Trump and the other Trump campaign defendants. This is a huge bombshell. Generally speaking, if you talk to your lawyer, those communications are protected by attorney-client privilege. No surprise there. If you talk to a third party who is not your attorney, the general rule is there is no attorney-client privilege whatsoever. Those communications are not privileged and they are discoverable. However, when you have multiple defendants on one side, often they share what's called a common interest, which means that what's good for one defendant is also good for the other defendants. And as a result, it's very favorable to be able to share information among different defendants and their lawyers. And you wouldn't want to share that information if it breached attorney-client privilege and those communications were exposed. So the court recognizes what's called a common interest doctrine, which allows those defendants to communicate back and forth. To do that, you have to sign what's called a joint defense agreement, which basically just codifies that relationship and allows communications to go back and forth. However, the wrinkle comes when one of those defendants no longer shares a common interest with the other defendants. When one of those defendants enters into a plea agreement, that defendant's interests are no longer aligned with the other defendants. The other defendants presumably want to fight the case and want to be proven innocent, whereas the defendant who has pled guilty wants a reduction in sentence and wants to make the prosecution's case as easy as possible. So in that circumstance, those defendants are no longer in the same common interest. So what generally happens is that when one defendant pleads out, they remove themselves from the joint defense agreement so that their communications are not exposed and discoverable, and the other defendant's communications are no longer exposed and discoverable. But apparently, that did not happen here. Even after Manafort entered into his plea agreement, was a cooperating witness with the Mueller team, and had pled guilty to the crimes alleged in the District of Columbia case, he was still part of the joint defense agreement with the rest of the Trump team. That means that the communications that any of the Trump lawyers and Trump defendants had with Manafort or his attorneys while under the guise of this joint defense agreement are no longer protected. If those communications and that work product is no longer protected by the joint defense agreement and no longer protected by the attorney-client privilege, then they are discoverable. If I was one of Mueller's investigators, I would simply send a written request over to not only Paual Manafort's lawyers, but to all of the Trump defendant lawyers, demanding that they turn over any communications and any work product that was shared amongst themselves while Paual Manafort was a cooperating witness. Because Paual Manafort doesn't have the same interests as the rest of the defendants and potential defendants in this investigation, the common interest doctrine doesn't apply, and the joint defense agreement can't protect all of their communications and their work product. Not only does this have malpractice written all over it, if the clients weren't apprised of the fact that they could be subject to these disclosures as a result of these secret communications, but on top of that, I don't think that Paual Manafort's lawyers are really going to be able to practice in federal court anymore, because no prosecutor would ever trust them to keep the terms of a plea agreement secret. And if you can't negotiate with the government, then your value as a federal criminal defense lawyer is really going to plummet. So why would someone do this? Well, a lot of people are speculating that Paul Manafort is angling for a presidential pardon, and that may be true. There are two schools of thought here. The first is that Paul Manafort thinks he is the smartest guy in the room and he can beat the federal prosecutors. It's not uncommon for criminals to think that they are smarter than they are and smarter than the prosecutors who are going to put them in jail, especially when it comes to white-collar criminals like Paul Manafort, who are used to getting away with skirting the law and beating regulators. So it may be that Manafort just thinks he can get away with it. He lied his way into this situation and he can lie his way out of this situation. We'll see. The second school of thought on this is that Manafort is angling for a presidential pardon. If he works with Mueller, he can get a reduction in sentence, but the theory is that if he works with President Trump, who can pardon him, he can avoid jail altogether. That could be, but there are some problems with that, because remember, Manafort has been charged in both Virginia and DC, and there have been credible reports that Manafort is guilty of all kinds of crimes in New York as well. And the problem for Manafort is that a lot of the same conduct for which he has already pled guilty could give rise to state-level charges. Specifically, in the case of Virginia and New York, he could be convicted of tax fraud. And remember, a presidential pardon can only pardon federal crimes, which would still leave Manafort on the hook for any state law crimes. On top of that, the Mueller team is probably going to retry Manafort on all of the crimes for which the jury hung in Virginia, and they will argue for an enhancement of sentencing for the crimes that Manafort has already pled guilty. In the latest status report, the Mueller team has promised to lay out all of Manafort's lies and failures to cooperate in great detail. It's going to be fascinating to read that document. We don't have those details right now, but they're going to argue for a sentence enhancement. But the bottom line is that Paul Manafort is going to spend a long time in either federal or state prison. Of course, he could put that time to good use by learning a new skill like learning how to draw. He could take classes on how to draw comic book characters by Robert Marzullo on Skillshare. In fact, he could learn how to draw a whole comic about a guy named Super Paul who resides in the Mana Fortress. Skillshare is an online learning community that has over 20,000 classes on everything like design, technology, business, you name it. And the first 500 Legal Eagles to click on the link below will get 2 free months of Skillshare just by clicking the link. The free premium membership gives you unlimited access to must-know topics so you can improve your skills and learn new things, just like Paul Manafort will when he goes to prison. So click on the link and start learning today. And until next time, I'll see you in court.